Many have come to the view over time that we live in a so-called post-marriage society. And I believe it was Aaron Clarey who either coined the term post-marriage or post-marriage society, or at the very least one of the earlier people who made use of the term. And on the face of it, this seems very plausible. We see that fewer and fewer people are getting married overall, and that marriage is an incredibly risky proposition for all involved, above all for the man. And people, as a general rule, don't seem to be striving for marriage anymore either. It almost appears to be an institution of the past. Well, I want to talk today about how true that is, in the sense that it is only partially true that we live in a post-marriage society. And something I've referred to in the past, but we're going to touch again upon the concept of cultural speciation. Because what ostensibly seems to be a post-marriage society is in fact only true for certain sectors of society, which is to say that there is a class of individuals in society for whom marriage works relatively well still. It's not perfect. It's certainly not as secure or stable as it was, say, 60 or 70 years ago. But nonetheless, this class, namely the upper class, the elites, the highly educated, the high earners, those who fit into the bracket of doing well socioeconomically in general, for these people, it's not a post-marriage society. Now, as for the reasons for getting married, it is pretty clear, based on all the evidence we've accumulated over many, many, many years, that if you want to raise offspring, a two-parent household consisting of a female and a male, i.e. a husband and a wife, are probably the best setup you're going to get to achieve that goal. But the problem is that we do simultaneously live in a post-marriage society. Marriage has crumbled for the middle class and the lower class. And in general, we don't really talk much in this current year about class. We talk about a lot of things, but not class. But class seems to matter here, inasmuch as marriage seems to be severely on the decline and downright dysfunctional for the middle class and lower class. Now, for the record, the fact that I'm addressing class, I get this comment sometimes, seems to imply to some people I'm somehow a Marxist or a socialist. No, I don't care about politics one whit anymore, and I've never been a Marxist or a socialist. I don't really have a political label. But to ignore the reality of the class divide, which is slowly but surely, or even rapidly, sundering the United States in twain, is foolhardy. Now, hand in hand with this goes this notion of luxury beliefs. Luxury beliefs, this term, was coined or created by Rob Henderson. He's an evolutionary psychologist, has a blog or a Substack. And the way luxury beliefs work is something along the lines of you say something, you preach something, but it doesn't actually map onto the reality out there, especially not for you. And he brought up this one example, how the first time that he had arrived at an Ivy League university in Yale a while back. And mind you, Dr. Henderson is just a really smart guy. He grew up in foster care, no parents, no anything. He basically lucked out in the intelligence department. Ends up at Yale. He talks to some woman who's going on and on about her beliefs about the world in the usual way that people rattle off these things at these institutions, and how she's a feminist and against marriage and conventional relationships. And then after all that rhetoric, Dr. Henderson proceeds to ask her what her plans are for the future. So she says something along the lines of, well, she's going to work for a while and then probably marry some guy and then have kids. Right after condemning the institution of marriage and the notion of conventional relationships. And of course, Dr. Henderson prods her on that. Well, for me, it's just my choice, but for these other people, they can choose whatever they want. This is one instance of a luxury belief. The family stability doesn't matter, and therefore marriage is irrelevant, and therefore mothers and fathers. Two-parent households are also irrelevant. Defunding the police is another example of a luxury belief. Lax views on immigration policy is a luxury belief. And so you see the common thread here. These beliefs that the wealthy and the educated purportedly hold and preach almost always have negative effects for everyone outside of their own socioeconomic/cultural bracket. So you take the example of you don't really need a two-parent household, you don't need a stable family. Well, on average, the wealthy and well-educated can get married and have a stable family anyway, so it doesn't really matter to them if they preach it. Or legalization of drugs. Well, on average, the wealthy and highly educated are going to have fewer mental health problems, fewer issues with drug addiction, etc., etc. And with respect to immigration, that's an obvious one. They typically live in wealthy neighborhoods and therefore are largely unaffected by the onslaught of third world immigration. So these are luxury beliefs, things that the upper class preaches but don't actually practice. And we have to understand why this has happened. Why has the functionality of marriage been largely confined to a small slice of society when it used to be just even across the board? You look at the rates of marriage and divorce in the 50s and 60s, there wasn't really a huge difference in terms of class, socioeconomic status. Now it's quite large. And I'll be posting a bunch of links below to some stats and some information, articles, etc. It's quite a lot to read off, so if you want to check it out, you can check it out there. But what does the upper class have going for it that the other classes typically don't? Well, on average, cognitive horsepower. And in addition to cognitive horsepower, on average, the upper class has access to a suite of psychological traits that redound to their benefit. So they're less likely to get addicted to substances, they're more likely to be conscientious, etc., etc. And all these things are beneficial. And the middle class, on average, has less cognitive horsepower. Basically, they're less smart than the upper class, on average. They also, on average, have a higher risk for issues with mental health. They're less likely to be conscientious. And the suite of psychological traits they have access to tends to be much more of a mixed bag. And then you move to the lower class, the bottom rung, and they really have gotten the short end of the stick. They're typically at the lowest end of cognitive horsepower, i.e., to put it bluntly, they're the dumbest of the lot, and they typically have a host of psychological issues. Much, if not most, of the homelessness you can observe, certainly in the United States, is down to mental health issues and just general dysfunctionality, which perfectly fits, unfortunately, the paradigm of the lower class. So, of course, we're only talking about averages here. It's important to bear in mind. But in general, on average, the upper class tends to be smarter than the middle class. They tend to have more positive psychological traits. And all of these things tend to lend themselves to more functional family units, especially in a post-religious society, which is to say, when you're of the cognitive and economic elite, there are a lot of potential things that can keep you going, that give you fuel to live your life and meaning, and things to strive for that don't necessarily exist for the middle class and almost certainly don't exist for the lower class. And so once again, on the front of intelligence and on the front of psychological health, what we really see here is a cognitive speciation event, where functional marriages and therefore functional families and therefore healthy families long-term are replicated across multiple generations. And unfortunately, the reports of social mobility have been greatly exaggerated. It tends to be pretty stable because there is a huge genetic factor here that people like to ignore, especially people on the left. For average people and below average people, they typically don't have as much going for them, and they need something to hold on to. Traditionally, goes without saying, what they held on to was religion. That was the glue that bound everyone together. But also notions of community, real community in the sense that you live there, you interact with the people, you help them out, etc., etc. And all of that has been falling apart, or to quote Charles Murray, it's been coming apart. And so yes, we live in a post-marriage society, but only for a certain group of people, a large group of people. Now for the record, I'm very average. I'm an average person. I'm of average intelligence, average looks, and in some respects below average. And there's a high probability that if you're watching my content, you're also an average person, i.e. an average man. And so to our eyes, if we're observing the world, what do we see? We see a lot of dysfunctionality. We see marriages not working, not coming into existence in the first place, and then falling apart once they do come into existence. And we see the general chaos that the postmodern internet landscape has wrought upon civilization and society. But if you're not average, and you're very educated, and you're earning high six figures, or you're a multimillionaire, you're not going to be seeing a lot of this stuff because you've sequestered yourself off from the rest of society. You're separate, and so you can have all these wacky beliefs, but you can preach them, you can pretend that you believe in it, all the while doing the exact opposite in your own life. Whatever we think about the institution of marriage, the reality is that a married, functional two-parent household is the best way to raise children if that's your goal. And that avenue has become nigh impossible for average people, especially average men, and certainly extremely difficult for men who are below average, whether it comes to looks, cognitive ability, or positive psychological traits. And the problem is the middle class and the lower class don't have a North Star anymore. There's no God anymore. There's no religion. They basically have nothing to live for other than junk food, video games, and the usual. This hollowing out process has been ongoing for a very long time, decades, but it has been accelerated enormously in the last 10 years. And to keep on drilling this home, this speciation event that's driven by cognitive differences between people has created, after a fashion, a different species of human being that functions in a different way. Basically, it is functional. So the upper class is functional in a way that the middle class is not. And certainly the bottom of the rung probably was never. And this seems almost impossible to repair, especially in light of the fact that very few people will acknowledge that. Now, the traditional pre-woke left was all too willing to acknowledge the needs of the working class and the poor, but they would never acknowledge an unfortunate reality of the working class and the poor, or of the wealthy for that matter. This idea that wealth and wealth accumulation and stability of wealth over multiple generations is just down to some sort of randomness or some kind of luck. No, it's predicated on having the good genes to build the wealth, maintain it, and pass it on to offspring that have the same good genes to build wealth, maintain it, etc., etc. That's why social mobility is, well, a little bit overrated, and probably not as much as a thing as people like to think it is. It's one of the many great American delusions at the end of the day. Almost nobody in the mainstream talks about this, and the few people who have talked about this historically, such as Charles Murray, have become pariahs for having been mischaracterized as a variety of virulent epithets that don't actually map onto reality, and so no one's going to address this. It's not going to improve. And increasingly, yes, we live in a post-marriage society, but only for a very large sector of that society. The elites, the functional, the well-educated, the wealthy, the smart, whatever, they're going to continue along and be just fine. They're going to live in their gated communities. They're going to get their nice fancy Ivy League degrees. They're going to get their nice jobs. They're going to find nice spouses. And overall, they're going to have highly functional and productive lives, whilst the rest of the country, the middle class and those below them, are going to decline and fall into the abyss ever more quickly. For all the ease and wonders of the current moment, this is not a good time to be average or below average, whether it comes to cognition, whether it comes to looks, whether it comes to positive psychological traits. This is a really bad time to be average or below average. And of course, here I am preaching to the wind because nothing's going to happen simply because I make a video about it and I talk about it. But someone needs to address this. The meme that we live in a post-marriage society is only partly true. And unfortunately, that applies to a whole bunch of other things. Health, longevity, general positive life outcomes. If you're average or below average, or even slightly above average, you might really be out of luck. Anyway, as always, thank you for tuning in. Appreciate it. Many special thanks to my patrons and donors on PayPal. You keep the channel going. Without you, the channel almost certainly would cease to exist. And if you can engage in the usual YouTube jazz of liking the video, sharing the video, leaving a comment, and subbing if you're not yet a sub, be much appreciated. And if I'm still alive, I'll check you out next time. Until then, may the gods truly watch over you. Bye-bye for now. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.